Hi there, I'm Oliver, and this is my sound booth. I undertook this project back in early July this year, needing a suitable recording environment so I may work from home, but without the expense of buying a professional pre-built isolation booth. In this video, I'm going to go over how this was constructed, but to start with, let's look at the materials needed for the structure. For the overall framework of the structure, I used 70 by 35mm structural pine. Either side of the ceiling and wall panels was 10mm thick plasterboard sheeting. The floor panel required more strength, so in place of plasterboard was 17mm thick structural plywood. To fill the air cavity in the panels, I used 75mm thick fiberglass insulation. For additional sound treatment, I used mass-loaded vinyl sheeting between the outer sheet and the framework, but I also included an inner layer for the floor and ceiling panels. Generous amounts of silicone was used to seal any gaps, cracks and crevices, keeping the panels airtight as well as sealing gaps in the completed structure. Binding the walls together were 125mm timber batten screws, with gravity doing the rest of the work to bind the floor and ceiling to the walls. Expanding foam was used on the exterior of the structure to seal cracks and crevices and provide added insulation. For added mobility, 28 individual casters with a 20kg weight limit per caster were affixed to the underside of the floor panel. So there we have all the critical materials needed to build the structure. Let's look at tools now. Absolutely crucial in any project is the use of a tape measure to ensure the correct measurements are applied. For this project, no tool was more useful than a cordless drill for all the various screws needed to bind the framework together, as well as various other fixtures. Anywhere the drill could not go, and for any instance where things needed a bit of a nudge, a good trusty hammer. Where the hardware store was unable to do some smaller timber cuts, I used a cordless buzzsaw. A sharp utility knife was absolutely critical in cutting insulation, mass-loaded vinyl and plasterboard sheets. A staple gun was utilised to attach the mass-loaded vinyl to the stud walls, as well as the various sound treatment materials such as the interior carpeting and acoustic foam. A caulking gun, which really goes without say given my earlier mention of how much silicone was used. Though in addition to silicone, it also came in handy for dispensing liquid nails for the ceiling and doors layers of mass-loaded vinyl. Less essential, but still useful tools to assist with measurements and positioning, a set square and a spirit level. If you're doing a project like this by yourself like I did, clamps are also your best friend for holding things in place prior to any drilling. So at this point, you've everything you need to construct the booth and on the road to victory with only the door, ventilation, electricity, interior sound treatment, and then all that's left is general aesthetics and customizing the layout to your needs. We'll look at the door next. The door is the overall weak point to the structure when it comes to sound getting in or out of the booth, so there is a bit of care that's required. I've seen many tutorials on sound booths, all with different methods on how to approach the door, but I'll show you what I did. The door was made up of 31mm thick MDF. To treat the door further, the exterior received a layer of mass-loaded vinyl as well as a layer of leftover plasterboard that I had. On the inside of the door, I used a layer of carpeting which reduced echo inside the booth, and again on the outside, though this time it was just for aesthetics. In the interest of having natural light get in, I cut a section of the door out and installed a makeshift double-glazed window with leftover perspex I had. The perspex had a 10mm thickness and was bound to the door with liquid nails with silicone applied all around to keep it airtight and stop sound getting in or out. I was undecided about whether I would have two doors, providing an airlock kind of entrance, or just a single door with a lot of effort going into sealing the gaps. I opted for the latter, with a makeshift door jamb from leftover pine, encompassing not just the sides and top, but the bottom as well. I lined these with weather stripping which provided additional insulation. For the door handle, just a simple lever action, with the door itself being held up by 3 standard butt hinges. On the inside, I also put 2 extra handles, one above and one below the door lever, just because the weather stripping was causing a bit of resistance and I didn't want to potentially yank the lever handle off entirely and potentially get stuck in here. Despite my misgivings, the door turned out to be pretty good. This next part of the project is one that most people tend to overlook, including myself when I first looked into building an isolation booth. That is, of course, ventilation. This is necessary because the structure will be very airtight and heavily insulated. If you neglect to address ventilation, not only will you be limited to short recording intervals due to lack of oxygen, but also overheating when you are generating a lot of body heat yourself, along with the heat generated from any electrical equipment you may have. There are a lot of ways this can be dealt with, but I'll go into what I did. Based on a couple of tutorials I saw, I decided I would have my air intake go through the lower part of the front wall panel with the door, and have the air extraction occur through the ceiling panel. The fans I used were specifically for air ducting. In the interest of making sure sounds of the fans don't interrupt my recordings, my good friend Luke, who is an electrician by trade, created a control panel box to adjust the speed of each fan, which can ensure airflow is still maintained while running practically silent. To prevent any outside sounds from getting into the booth via the ducting, I utilised insulated ducting of the 100mm variety, adding a couple of bends in it as well. I was two minds about how to address getting wire into the structure. Originally, I'd planned to thread the cables through the air intake, but I didn't want to risk any cables rattling about, and I felt it may prove to be a royal pain in the ass to remove the ducting just to get to the cables should there be any problems in that area. Instead, and again with Luke's helpful advice, I opted for a faceplate on the interior of the structure instead. I realised the cavity just above the door would be perfect to accommodate this. It was insulated with leftover fiberglass with just a small access port for the cables to come in from the outside, with the faceplate itself being mounted on the inside. The ports I chose to have present were two USB for the audio interface and webcam, one aux port for the headphones, one VGA port for the computer monitor, and then a HDMI port, well, just in case. I also needed a small power board for powering the monitor as well as lighting, so the cable for that was threaded through a very small hole on the outer panel and sealed up accordingly. For the lighting, I opted for a small USB LED light, flexible so that it can be repositioned as need be. So, that is now the ventilation and electrical needs of the booth accommodated. It is highly advisable that if you don't have a Luke to refer to, or are otherwise not in the electrical trade yourself, to ask any friends or family who may be in the trade for any advice in this area. We are now on the home stretch with only interior sound treatment and customization to be done. I probably did a bit more than I needed to when lining the interior of the booth. I utilised cost-effective carpeting, the same kind of material used for vehicle flooring. There was still a bit of boominess and echo, so I then added acoustic foam of the egg crate style to the ceilings and walls, with bass traps in each corner. I found that by using this type of foam, I didn't need to stress about the likes of parallel ceiling and floor. If I could do this project again, I'd not have used so much carpet, though I must say that has worked out well for the floor and door, just keeping it all aesthetically pleasing. Customization is really up to the individual user. What I wanted was not just to be able to record inside, but also edit if need be, so that I'm not needlessly going back and forth between my booth and desk. So I included a small corner desk to this end, with a wall-mounted monitor, which is paired with my secondary monitor via a VGA splitter. Being space conscious, I bought a cheap mini wireless keyboard with a mouse pad, which, while is never going to be as good as a proper keyboard and mouse, is easy on space, even though I must say the end result for this booth ended up being much more spacious than I'd envisioned. In closing this presentation, I'm quite pleased with the end result. While it's not perfectly soundproof, it does reduce outdoor noise considerably, to the point where there would need to be quite substantial noise directly outside the booth to infiltrate my recordings. Moreover, it provides a professional level recording environment so that working from home is now a reality. I designed it so that it can be disassembled into 6 modules and reassembled if I need to move, and having casters as well make it very easy to rearrange the studio if need be. All of this was achieved without breaking the bank, with the approximate cost being about 2k and a few weekends of time. If I could give any advice to those of you who want to build your own booth, I would suggest be as accurate as you can with measurements, and if you have any friends or family available to help you to construct it, take the assistance they can provide. While I'm happy with my end product, if I'd taken extra time to plan and measure, as well as have another pair of hands, I could have done this quicker and maybe a little better. In closing this presentation, I'd really like to thank everyone who has given me support over the years, and especially in relation to this particular project. Whether it's been by liking and sharing my content, subscribing to my various social media channels, or most importantly, those of you that have verbally given me encouragement as well to go on with this project, so special thanks to you guys there. Also a shout out to those of you that have put up tutorials with these DIY vocal booths. For a very long time I didn't even know where to start or how to go out even thinking of building such a thing. But then recently I stumbled across quite a few good tutorials from which I could draw inspiration and a few ideas. So thanks for sharing that out there, and I hope that this little tutorial that I've done helps to sort of contribute to those of you watching that may also be inspired to go about doing such a thing as well. So I must say I'm very, very happy with the end product. I'm very excited to start dabbling in here and see what creations I can come up with. But more importantly, also being able to start work from home. So that's long been my ambition there, and finally I can see that come to fruition. So I'm starting to feel that some good things are finally in the pipeline there. So thanks again, guys. Cheers.